The dramatic encounter between Nigel Farage and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer over the escalating farmer riots marked a pivotal moment in the country's political discourse. At its core, the event highlighted not only the stark ideological divisions within British politics, but also the deepening frustrations among the farming community, a traditionally vital demographic that has found itself at odds with government policies. Farage, with his characteristic populist vigor, capitalized on the situation to dismantle Starmer's perceived inadequacies in addressing the crisis. The event carried significant implications for Britain's agricultural future and its broader political landscape. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The backdrop of these events was the growing unrest among farmers, who had been staging protests for weeks. They voiced grievances over policies that they claimed endangered their livelihoods, ranging from restrictive environmental regulations to trade agreements that exposed British farmers to foreign competition. This discontent came to a head in the form of widespread riots, as rural communities felt abandoned and unheard. For many, it was not merely a matter of policy failure, but a betrayal of the government's duty to protect an industry integral to the nation's economic and cultural fabric. Farage, ever the opportunist, seized the moment to position himself as the champion of the disillusioned farming community. With his flair for sharp rhetoric and a keen understanding of populist sentiment, he painted Starmer as out of touch with the needs of ordinary Britons. Farage's critique centered on the notion that Starmer's government was prioritizing globalist agendas over national interests, a narrative that resonated deeply with the protesting farmers. The imagery of Farage standing amidst a sea of tractors and placards, addressing an impassioned crowd, became emblematic of his campaign to dismantle Starmer's credibility. At the heart of Farage's takedown was the issue of trade deals. He accused Starmer's administration of recklessly negotiating agreements that flooded the UK market with cheap agricultural imports, undercutting domestic producers. For farmers, these deals were seen as the ultimate betrayal, reducing their produce to commodities unable to compete with lower-priced, lower-standard imports. Farage's argument struck a chord, highlighting the perceived short-sightedness of policies that valued international diplomacy over the welfare of local industries. This critique was amplified by vivid examples of farmers struggling to keep their businesses afloat, their struggles epitomizing the human cost of what Farage described as Starmer's betrayal of Britain. Farage also zeroed in on environmental regulations that had become a flashpoint for the agricultural community. While the government framed these policies as essential steps toward combating climate change, many farmers viewed them as unworkable mandates that ignored the realities of modern farming. The restrictions on fertilizer use, the push for rewilding, and limits on livestock emissions were seen as overly aggressive measures that stifled productivity. Farage deftly framed this as yet another example of Starmer's detachment from rural concerns, contrasting it with his own portrayal as a champion of common sense. The riots themselves became a powerful symbol of rural Britain's frustration. Images of tractors blockading highways and fields dotted with banners accusing the government of betrayal painted a stark picture of the widening divide between urban policymakers and rural communities. Farage capitalized on this imagery, using it to bolster his argument that Starmer's government was systematically alienating a vital segment of the population. He argued that the riots were not an isolated incident but a symptom of broader systemic failures, a breakdown in communication and trust between the government and the governed. Farage's rhetorical assault extended to the perceived elitism of Starmer's administration. He accused the Prime Minister of being ensconced in London-centric politics, blind to the struggles of those outside the metropolitan bubble. This line of attack resonated deeply with the farming community, who felt increasingly marginalized in national conversations. Farage skillfully juxtaposed his own man-of-the-people persona against what he painted as Starmer's technocratic aloofness. This framing allowed him to cast himself not just as a critic, but as a viable alternative voice for the disenfranchised. The clash also brought into focus the broader ideological battle over Britain's post-Brexit identity. Farage framed the government's handling of agricultural policy as a betrayal of the very promises that had underpinned the Brexit campaign, a return to sovereignty and a focus on domestic prosperity. For farmers who had supported Brexit in hopes of escaping the EU's common agricultural policy, the reality of the government's post-Brexit strategy felt like a cruel irony. Farage tapped into this disillusionment, accusing Starmer of squandering the opportunities of Brexit and reducing the UK to a pawn in global trade dynamics. The event's implications extended beyond the immediate crisis. Farage's dismantling of Starmer's approach signaled a potential shift in the political landscape, with rural discontent becoming a rallying point for broader opposition to the government. The protests were not just about farming. They became a microcosm of wider dissatisfaction with an administration perceived as out of step with the needs of ordinary citizens. Farage's intervention underscored his ability to channel this dissatisfaction, raising questions about the durability of Starmer's leadership and the resilience of his policy agenda. The visual and rhetorical theatrics of the event were matched by its media impact. Farage's performance captured headlines, dominating the news cycle and forcing the government to respond. This created a narrative in which Starmer appeared reactive rather than proactive, further fueling perceptions of a leadership struggling to maintain control. Farage's mastery of media optics allowed him to set the terms of the debate, presenting himself as the voice of reason in a sea of governmental incompetence. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Farage's critique was its emotional resonance. While Starmer relied on technocratic justifications for his policies, Farage appealed directly to the fears and frustrations of his audience. He spoke not in abstract policy terms, but in the language of lived experience, recounting the struggles of individual farmers and painting a vivid picture of a government out of touch with the human impact of its decisions. This emotional appeal gave his arguments a potency that Starmer's measured responses struggled to counter. The farmer riots and the accompanying political drama also highlighted deeper questions about the future of British agriculture. The sector was already grappling with significant challenges, from labor shortages to shifting consumer preferences and the pressures of global competition. Farage's critique of Starmer underscored the urgency of addressing these challenges in a way that balanced environmental sustainability with economic viability. The failure to do so, he argued, risked not only the livelihoods of farmers but also the nation's food security and cultural heritage. The confrontation also illuminated the broader tensions between rural and urban Britain. The riots were not just a reaction to agricultural policy, they were a manifestation of the growing sense of alienation felt by rural communities. Farage's rhetoric tapped into this divide, portraying Starmer's government as emblematic of an urban elite disconnected from the realities of rural life. This narrative had the potential to resonate far beyond the farming community, amplifying broader concerns about regional inequalities and the centralization of political power. While the immediate focus was on Starmer's response to the crisis, the event raised larger questions about leadership and accountability. Farage's critique painted a picture of a government adrift, unable to anticipate or effectively respond to the needs of its citizens. This perception of weakness could have far-reaching implications for Starmer's ability to maintain public trust and deliver on his policy agenda. The confrontation with Farage highlighted the challenges of governing in an era of heightened populist sentiment, where the ability to connect emotionally with the electorate is as important as the substance of policy. In the wake of the farmer riots, it became clear that the crisis was not merely a policy failure, but a moment of reckoning for the Starmer administration. The clashes between protesters and authorities, the media frenzy, and Farage's unrelenting critique combined to create a perfect storm of political vulnerability. The event underscored the precariousness of Starmer's position, with his leadership coming under scrutiny from both his opponents and within his party. Farage's dismantling of Starmer's approach to the farmer riots was a masterclass in political opportunism. By aligning himself with the grievances of rural Britain, he positioned himself as a credible alternative to the status quo. The confrontation highlighted the potency of populist rhetoric in an era of disillusionment, and underscored the challenges facing leaders who struggle to connect with the concerns of ordinary citizens. For Starmer, the event served as a sobering reminder of the political risks of policy missteps and the need for more effective engagement with the electorate. The events surrounding the farmer riots and Nigel Farage's confrontation with Prime Minister Keir Starmer presented an intricate web of political, social, and economic dimensions that extended far beyond their immediate implications. As the drama unfolded, it became evident that this was more than a momentary eruption of discontent. It was a bellwether for the deep-rooted tensions reshaping the fabric of British society. The crisis, amplified by Farage's relentless critique, demanded a more nuanced exploration of its origins, underlying causes, and long-term ramifications. One of the most striking aspects of the crisis was the role of rural identity in fueling the protests. Farmers, often romanticized as stewards of the land and symbols of national resilience, found themselves increasingly marginalized in a society moving toward urbanization and globalization. Their anger was not just about trade deals or environmental policies, but about a perceived erosion of their cultural and economic significance. Farage tapped into this sentiment, presenting himself as a voice for those who felt invisible in contemporary Britain. His rhetoric illuminated a broader cultural divide, one that pitted the traditions of rural life against the accelerating pace of modernity. This identity crisis within the farming community had been building for years. The transition from EU agricultural policies to a domestic framework promised greater freedom for British farmers, but the reality was far more complex. Many felt that the promised benefits of Brexit had not materialized, and instead, they faced mounting challenges. Farage's critique of Starmer capitalized on these frustrations, portraying the government's policies as a betrayal of the very ethos of Brexit. This narrative resonated particularly strongly in areas that had overwhelmingly supported leaving the EU, where the disillusionment was not just economic, but ideological. Another critical factor in the unfolding crisis was the evolving role of environmentalism in British politics. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable agriculture had become central to the national agenda, but the implementation of policies to address these issues often clashed with the realities of farming. Initiatives such as rewilding and reductions in emissions targets were seen as existential threats by farmers who were already operating on thin margins. Farage's rhetoric adeptly framed these policies as examples of an overreaching state, disconnected from the practicalities of rural life. This critique resonated deeply, fueling the perception that environmentalism was being weaponized against traditional livelihoods. The farmer riots also underscored the power of grassroots movements in shaping political discourse. What began as localized protests quickly escalated into a nationwide phenomenon, with farmers from across the country converging in acts of defiance. The use of tractors to block major roads and the staging of dramatic visual protests captured the public's attention, creating a sense of urgency that forced the government to respond. These demonstrations were a reminder of the capacity of ordinary citizens to disrupt the political status quo, especially when united by a shared sense of grievance. Farage's ability to align himself with this movement further highlighted his skill in harnessing grassroots energy for political gain. As the crisis unfolded, it also brought into sharp focus the vulnerabilities of modern governance. Starmer's administration, already navigating the complexities of post-Brexit Britain and a recovering economy, was ill-prepared for the intensity of the farmer riots. The government's response appeared reactive and fragmented, exacerbating perceptions of incompetence. Farage capitalized on this, portraying Starmer as a leader unable to anticipate or address the needs of his constituents. This framing not only undermined Starmer's credibility, but also raised broader questions about the capacity of contemporary governments to manage complex, multidimensional crises. The media played a pivotal role in amplifying the crisis, shaping public perceptions, and intensifying the pressure on Starmer's administration. Coverage of the riots, coupled with Farage's relentless commentary, created a narrative that cast the government as both out of touch and ineffective. Social media further fueled this dynamic, with images and videos of protesting farmers spreading rapidly and galvanizing public opinion. Farage's adept use of media channels to amplify his critique highlighted the growing importance of communication strategies in modern politics. His ability to dominate the narrative underscored the power of a well-executed media campaign in shaping political outcomes. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on Nigel Farage's critique of Keir Starmer's handling of farmer riots? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.